Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, in 1620 the Lord Chancellor of England was the distinguished scholar Lord Verulam. He was not just a lawyer, born Francis Bacon, he was also a philosopher and scientist, and that year he published the book that has come to be seen as his masterpiece. The Novum Organum proposes a new approach to the investigation of the laws of nature, a scientific method based on experience and observation. My method, wrote Bacon, though hard to practice, is easy to explain. I open and lay out a new and certain path for the mind to proceed in, starting directly from the simple sensuous perception. Bacon's new and certain path is often seen as the beginning of the modern scientific method, a set of rules guiding scientific inquiry which have been the subject of intense debate over the intervening 500 years. Some scholars have seen the scientific method as an essential part of modern scholarship. Others, like the 19th century biologist Thomas Huxley, regard it as an extension of common sense. With me to discuss the scientific method are Simon Schaffer, Professor of the History of Science at the University of Cambridge, John Worrell, Professor of the Philosophy of Science at the London School of Economics, and Michela Massimi, Senior Lecturer of the Philosophy of Science at University College London. Simon Schaffer, would you begin by giving us a slightly more precise idea of what is meant by the phrase scientific method?
Well, we would like our stories about the world to be true and as simple as they possibly can be, and to have as large an extent as possible to be maybe even universal. But the world, as finance ministers, for example, keep on discovering, is messy and complicated and hard to explain or predict. And scientific method has come to be seen as a way of reconciling those two, our stories about the world with the way the world works. We'd like there, perhaps, to be a series of methods or recipes or rules that would, as far as possible, guarantee that our accounts of the world are what we want them to be. These rules might include principles of observation, experiment, reasoning. They're also very often going to specify who we might trust to produce such stories, and indeed where they might be, what kinds of places, what kinds of tools they might use. So scientific method in its widest sense is, I think, an essential part of perhaps a human desire to understand the way in which the world around us works.
Where do we look for the first examples of the scientific method? Where else would we look?
Where else would we look? Presumably all great literate cultures have had these concerns with adequate accounts of the world and people and methods in which trust should be vested. For the Western tradition, the tradition to which Francis Bacon belongs, one looks back to the Greeks, to Plato and Aristotle, to the transmission of their debates through Islamic and Latin commentaries in the Middle Ages. Plato proposes a rather pithy version of the problem of method, that if we're engaged in an inquiry, says Plato, and we already know the topic of inquiry, then the inquiry is pointless. And if we don't know the point of inquiry, then the inquiry is useless. To which Aristotle develops a very powerful answer, which is presumably observing the world would give us an account of what problems there are that inquiry might address. And for Aristotle, there had always been these two kinds of issues. Facts, things that happen in the world. We'd like to know why. We search for causes. And things, we'd like to know what there is in the world, and we'd like to know their essences. And there are methods that Aristotle and his commentators discuss which might allow us to do that. Now, for Aristotle and for the great medieval tradition, there was a model of how that kind of reasoning might proceed, and that model came from mathematics. And a lot of the Western tradition prior to Bacon had focused on exactly how mathematical models of reasoning and natural philosophical models of reasoning, that's to say reasoning about what there is in the world, could possibly relate to each other. And it's in that debate, I think, that it's interesting to put Bacon's intervention.
Given that mathematics through Euclid was thought to be an instance of perfect truth.
Yes, if the premises of a mathematical demonstration are true and the demonstration is logically adequate, then its consequences are true.
as we know, John Worrell, Aristotle flowed through, translated, developed in the Arabic world into the Renaissance in Western Europe. And so we're going to move on just as swiftly as I moved on. Mm-hmm. But the scientific method relies heavily on reasoning, and scientists have adopted one of two or even three approaches. Can you tell us about the inductive method?
I think it's probably better if we start with deduction and then compare it with induction, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. I can just switch the question. So question 4 becomes question 3.
Okay.
We start with deduction.
Yes, thank you. So in a deduction, as Simon's just mentioned, so both methods of inference involve starting with certain premises and inferring certain conclusions from them. In a deduction or deductively valid inference, the conclusion is completely guaranteed to be true if the premises are.
Can you give us an example?
So the old and famous example that people use all the time in elementary logic is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. If it's true that all men are mortal and that Socrates is a man, then of course it must be true that Socrates is mortal. Maybe some of his young followers would like to have believed that Socrates was immortal, but if they accepted that he was only a man and that all men are mortal, they in all consistency could not accept that. So in a deduction, really, we're teasing out the consequences of what are already in the premises. The process may surprise us, but we're basically only we're getting out of the premises what's already in them.
So can we just dig in there a little bit more,
Sure.
more, John? We've got plenty of time. Can you give us some more instances of these are sort of having an idea, having a notion, and then trying to prove it? Is that too basic?
No, how you get your starting point is another matter. But we start in mathematics with certain axioms. We can talk about how to arrive at those axioms, but Euclid gives us certain axioms for simple relationships between points and lines and spaces and planes and so on. And then we, in mathematics, deduce from those axioms ineluctable consequences of interesting kind, like the sum of all the internal angles of any triangle add up to 180 degrees. The main role of deduction in science is in the testing process, where we take a theory. There's a whole story to be told, obviously, how we arrive at interesting theories, but let's put that to one side. We've arrived at some theory and we want to test it, and we test it by deducing from it, in this ineluctable sense, often very surprisingly, certain consequences from it, together with some background assumptions and extra principles, but fundamentally from the theory. So, for example, from Einstein's general theory of relativity, you can deduce that if you look at the motion of Mercury over time, you'll see that the point